forward at the end of the Civil War, and then we went backward. More so than we would have if there had been a new election. Because if there had been a new election, there still would be reason for that person running, even if they were on the other side, to try to find some compromise positions. Andrew Johnson inherited power with very few limitations on how he used that power. Congress wasn't even in session. And so this became very directly a problem because Andrew Johnson started pardoning Southerners, allowing them to come back into power.
So he had like a few months where he just went wild.
Yeah. It's giving the car keys to someone who's not prepared to drive, but decided that they're going to do what they want with the car for a while.
All right. Is there any level to which power corrupted Lincoln, a war president?
Yes, I do think there were some areas. And I think that even though he was a great president, if not our greatest president, maybe one of the greatest figures of our history, he was flawed. One is his problem of succession, but also I think Lincoln overinvested in the power of the presidency. He came to believe too much in the role of one man and not in creating a more balanced approach to governance. And that's a function of war. That's where war is dangerous. War has an inherent centralizing power in a democracy. And that is dangerous because even when you have the best of people running a war, that gives them a lot of power to make decisions.
Yeah, how do you come down from that? I see that with Zelensky and Putin currently.
Yep.
It's a war. How do you come down? Because Ukraine and anybody in a war kind of, especially if you're fighting for the ideal of democracy, it seems like war is anti-democratic.
It is.
So how do you come down from that? What's the interesting mechanism some of it is leadership. You have to be like a George Washington type figure, be able to walk away from power.
I think you gave the answer right there.
Yeah.
You need to walk away from power or you need to be forced to walk away from power. Historically, one of the things that democracies have tended to do when they have a chance is to vote out of office the victor in the war. Think about Winston Churchill. Roosevelt is elected to his fourth term when he's still in the war. It's not clear that he would have been elected again, let's say he lived on, because there is a sensibility that the person has become too powerful in this role and that someone else should now step in, someone else who's also not a war president but has other interests. So let's hope Ukraine wins this war. Zelensky should then step down or someone else should be voted in. It will be dangerous if he remains president. Let's say he wins somehow and a true victory, just as this hypothetical. He should not be he should be praised, maybe given a nice villa, but someone else should take over because the problem is that he's going to have too much power, and honestly, he's going to be too out of touch with what the country needs after the war.
What do you think would have happened if Lincoln had lived? That's the sort of counterfactual view of history. It's an interesting question that probably you think about a lot. This gets stories a lot. What would have happened if he didn't get assassinated?
It's a reasonable question because it was not inevitable he'd be assassinated.
Right.
He could have had more protection that night. He'd invited Ulysses Grant to go to the theater with him, and Grant and his wife didn't go. If they had been there would have been more protection for Grant. So you would have had at least double the security there. So there are many ways in which he might not have died. I think it still would have been a difficult transition. But I think there were a few things that would have been better. First of all, Lincoln would not have pardoned all of these Confederate leaders and allowed them to come back into power. Lincoln also would have been a better politician at holding his Republican coalition together. And I think Lincoln was more committed to empowering former slaves and others. So we still would have had a lot of conflicts, but I think what would have been a degree of difficulty was doubled or tripled because Lincoln was removed and the opposite came into power with Andrew Johnson.
So you don't think there's a case you made that Andrew Johnson turned out to be a bad decision, but the spirit of the decision is the correct one?
No, I think it was a terrible decision because you should never put someone one step away from enormous power who's not prepared.
Oh, in that sense.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I got it. But the spirit of the decision, meaning you put somebody who's represents a very opposing viewpoint than you.
Well, I'm for that so long as that person is on board with some of the basic values that you're pursuing and that person is capable of doing the job.
Well, do you think that was obvious to him, that Andrew Johnson was not capable of doing the job?
Yes.
Okay.
It's in everyone recognized that. But it made sense. What Lincoln has to be praised for is in the midst of a war when at that point he was not doing well. The war was not going well. He ran for re-election. He didn't try to postpone the election. He didn't try to do anything.
Yeah.
And so he needed all the help he could get when running. And so he wanted to have someone on there who looked like a unity candidate who could appeal to some Southerners. So it made sense from a political point of view, but it created a really big problem. And there were people who said he should have removed Johnson as soon as he was elected. And in retrospect, he probably should have.
How gangster is that to during a war still run the election?
It's extraordinary. I mean, Lincoln believed in democratic values. He also believed he would win, but he knew it was not guaranteed.
Yeah.
And it's interesting for people who don't know this. The reason we have mail-in balloting in the U.S. is because of that. So, almost I think almost 1 million Union voters are away from their homes, and so how do they vote? As soldiers, as nurses, they vote by mail. The post office delivers their ballots. That's why we have mail-in balloting.
What about the other counterfactual question of what would have happened if Confederate States won the war?
The Confederate States had won the war. You would have seen, I think, a separate country in the South. You would have seen two countries, and that Confederate country would have been a smaller country, but it probably would have been able to defend itself because it would have actually gotten much richer than it was. It was poor at the time, but through its cotton trade and other things, it would have been recognized by Great Britain, by France, by other societies, and you would have seen a Southern Republic. I don't think you would have seen that Southern Republic dominate the continent. The Union had the men and people and had the resources, but you would have seen a rival republic to the United States in the South.
Do you think they had interest to dominate the continent, to take over the Union?
They had a foreign policy. They had a plan. Many have written about this. They had plans, many Southerners did, of expanding into the Caribbean, which was actually more feasible. They did not have the personnel to occupy so much territory going out west, if you think about the amount of land that had to be covered. But they had the nautical capabilities and naval power and the money to dominate islands in the Caribbean, and those islands were important for their trade. So there were many Southerners who wanted to take control of Cuba, wanted to take control of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and so you probably would have seen Southern warfare in those areas.
From a counterfactual history perspective, can you make the case that secession would have created a better world? Like if we were sitting today and do Back to the Future thing, the secession in this context, if we put aside the suffering and the loss of life in the war, that we would be in a better world today? Just looking at the political climate. And can you also make the case that actually this outcome of the Union winning the war is the better one?
I think the Union victory is by far the better outcome, because I think what you would have had otherwise is you would have had a slave republic in the South that would have encouraged slavery in other parts of the world, would have exported slavery, and would have necessarily been hostile to many of the positive changes that occur in the Union, the movement toward progressive reforms, creating cities with health codes and public education and many of those things. Public education really develops in the North as a way of training workers who are being paid to be better workers in a factory. Mm-hmm. There's a reason you don't educate slaves, because if you educate slaves, they'll rebel.
Yeah, so don't you think there'll be a huge pressure from the North to abolish slavery anyway?
There would have, but I think the South could have survived without another war. I mean, I think the way that slavery would have ended in the South, if it didn't end with the Civil War, it would have been with another war.
I guess the deeper question is it better to work through your problems together, or is it better to get a divorce?
I think in this case, it was better to work through the problems. It's not even working through them together. It's better to work through the problems where one side has the resources to incentivize you to work through the problems rather than leaving you on your own to go your own direction. I think the argument against the Union winning would be the argument that would be made by those who believe they suffered from Union power later on. So you could argue, if you're a historian of Native Americans, if you're a historian of the Philippines, you could argue some of the areas where this newly united nation coming out of the Civil War was able to use its power to spread its influence. It would have been harder for the Union to do that if the Union had to deal with a rival to the South.
So as a historian, the Union won. To which degree are the people from the Union, that is now the United States, the writers of the history that color the